Good luck. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Bill Vaughn. I'm still a developer trainer at Microsoft Technical Education. Now, this group is responsible for training the developers inside Microsoft that are writing applications. We don't train the MAMDAC people, obviously, no matter how much they need. I shouldn't have put that on tape. But we do train developers inside Microsoft that are developing websites, that are developing client-server applications, the company store app, and the ones that you see from the outside, those people come to us for training. It's a tightly knit group, and most of us have many, many years of experience. So we're called Ushani's Volunteers. Ushani was our old manager because of the fact that we've all got 10, 12, 14 years at Microsoft. And that group is thinning out as I'm retiring on the 17th of July and going into private practice, as we said before. So let's go into this particular topic. I've got a note here on my thing here. It says, please see me, and you're already in trouble with what you said last time. Okay. They tell me that my book, the latest Hitchhiker's Guide, is going to be in the bookstore over here, and I will sign anybody's book. Unlike the baseball players, I do not charge for that yet. But pick up my website. I've got some information up on my website about MSDE. For example, MSDE does not ship with a way to create a database. So if you don't have the developer tools, and some people have that, there's a little application up there, source included, that's going to be there. I'll also have a new application that we're distributing at VBits that you can run this wizard. It's an add-in to Visual Basic that lets you create the stored procedure parameters collection interactively. So it lets you create that source code, which is kind of cool. And that'll be up on that website as well. Did we talk about this last time? Yeah. Say yes loudly so the TV can hear you. Yes. Thank you. This particular session talks about optimizing data access with Visual Basic, and we'll talk about some other things that we didn't talk about last time. Is this thing falling apart or what? Yes, little pieces are falling off. We'll talk about ADO 2.5 and how it impacts VB6, and there are a number of interesting implications when we load 2.5 on our systems. We'll then focus on passing data between tiers and then writing smarter ADO code that we haven't already talked about. 2.5. Where does 2.5 come from? Well, when you install SQL Server 7, what do you get? 2.1. When you install Shiloh, what do you SQL Server 2000, what do you get? 2.6. So where did 2.5 come from? Somewhere else. It is the latest version of ADO, and we'll talk about the versions very quickly. But if you want to get a copy of this, the MDAC install, the MDAC refers to the entire bundle of ADO and all the associated providers and ODBC drivers and all the hoodle hodl, that's a technical term, they go with it. And you can pull it down off the web. And that's about the only distribution method. Actually, 2.5 is built into this thing called Windows 2000. It's built into Windows 2000 in a different way. You know, and when you wanted to change your mind with Windows 98 or Windows NT4, and you said, well, you know, I don't want that version of ADO on my system anymore because it causes some sort of a side effect, you could uninstall it. That's not an option anymore. ADO 2.5 is woven into the fabric of the system software and is no longer considered an add-on, something that's cute to deal with. So you've got it, and there's no backing out. So you're going to have it, and that means your customers are not going to be able to uninstall it either. So before you use it, make sure you understand what's going on with the product. Make sure you understand the implications of 2.5. In my humble opinion, 2.5 is very, very powerful. So it has lots of cool features, and it is, I have seen very, very few issues moving from 2.1 to 2.5. That's the good news. The bad news is that it's very different than 2.0. How many people are still using 2.0? Good, some. There's different than 2.0. So you'll see some incompatibilities when you move from 2.0 to 2.1 or 2.0 to 2.5. One of the things that you'll discover is that when you make a reference to this in your Visual Studio, Visual Basic application, you're going to be pointing to the ADO 2.5 library. However, when you use the Data Environment Designer, you'll discover that its events no longer work correctly if they reference the record set object. That's because the ADO 2.1 and 2.5 now record set object is different. It has more properties, different interfaces, and it still uses the same GUID. I thought there was a rule about that. Yeah, but so we've got a number of issues there that you can work around in some cases. The ADO data control, same problem. In this case, you don't have the options of linking things, so it doesn't work very well. Data form wizard broken. Visual data manager. However, the source is available here, so you can recompile this puppy and get it to work again. The data environment designer, I have been told that there is a fix in the wings for this entire problem. We're going to resync, as I understand, this is not official, you didn't hear it from me, that they are going to resync and solve this problem in a future service pack for Visual Studio. The question is, once they fix it, will they break older apps? And that's a dilemma they're trying to solve. So the ADO 2.0 object model, in of itself, is fairly straightforward. And those of you who have worked with this before are familiar with this structure. It is different than the hierarchical record set, hierarchical structure that we were had to deal with the DAO and with RDO. And having, helped develop RDO in the olden days, we were basically forced to use this hierarchical object model, and we're very happy to be able to get away from that to basically use 3 separate and distinct objects that can be independently created. In other words, you can create a record set object without having created a command object, without having created a connection object, and use it as a standalone record set. If necessary, you can create a record set object and through a connection object or command object as necessary, but only create the ones you need. It turns out that ADO is creating these objects behind the scenes in some cases, but not always. And remember, every time you create one of these objects, it's costing you time. And while that may not make a lot of difference in the client-server world, as we move to middle tier or active server page development, those kinds of issues can make a big difference between being able to support 50 or 70 users, or 5,000 and 7,000 users, because of the extra instantiations. Now, 2.5 adds on to this object model the record object and the stream object, both of which are very interesting in the sense that they deal with specific issues that you may never encounter, but are nonetheless there. And the size of the download has now increased to 7.5 meg. That is not to say that's what it's going to cost you on your hard disk or your in memory, because that's the compressed version. That's the cab files and stuff that comes in. So it may be considerably larger. Your mileage may vary. So this record object is extremely interesting for things like data providers that don't return traditional record sets, such as when you do a directory or open a file, working with ADO on the file basis or working with the directory structure. It's designed to deal with special issues that are not associated with relational databases. So this record object, as we've said, is for directories and not necessarily for traditional record sets, although you can store some traditional looking record sets in there. However, the stream object is also another new paradigm. For example, in the middle tier, you could in fact create a record set, standalone record set, and persist it, save it someplace. Well, in the earlier versions, the 2.1 time frame, you could in fact save it as an XML file, and it physically wrote the guide to disk. Now, in the middle tier, passing that file someplace was kind of problematic, maybe not such a good idea. So there was no real way except passing the record set object itself to another tier. And we'll talk about these various techniques here in a minute. The stream object adds another dimension to this. Now you can create an object that is basically a persisted record set, but is now saved in memory. And this object can, in fact, be persisted in a number of formats. You can persist it in XML format or the ADTG format. And that way, you can, in fact, send this stream or expose this XML stream to another layer. And we'll show you how that works here in a minute. So we can move between record set and XML, stream to XML back to record set if we'd like. The stream is simply the means of transmission here. ADO 2.5 also exposed the usage of a way to access data through URL usage. In other words, we're opening not so much a SQL server, but we're just pointing to an active server page, for example. This active server page simply exposes an XML record set. So you simply point to that web page, it sends back an XML structure, and you've got a record set, just like you hit a database. Interesting. And as we move into the Visual Studio 7 timeframe, you'll see how these new pieces start fitting in the bigger puzzle of things. ADO 2.5 also has new error handlers. This is good. As I understand it, Bill saw the other Bill saw the error handlers, and he got a couple of error occurred messages. And he was, to say the least, a little irritated at this, and decided to make some changes that, in fact, caused a number of these error messages to be rewritten. That's good. So many of these error messages no longer say error occurred. They say, no, they don't say that. They say things like, the object instantiation has not been correct. The problem that they were faced with is, remember that ADO is built in layers. In other words, we have a low-level physical TDS parser down here that's looking at the tabular data stream. It encounters a TDS packet error. Unfortunately, it's being called by an object, it's being called by an object, it's being called by an object, being called by an object, being called by you, 12 objects away. You don't really care that the TDS packet is corrupted. You care that the query didn't complete, because all you did was ask it to create a query. So what kind of message should you get back? TDS packet corruption? Does that tell you much? Since the TDS is proprietary, that's not something you should have to deal with. It may be a perfectly ordinary situation. So trying to decide how much granularity should be returned to you, maybe it's because the parameter you passed in when you created this record set was invalid for the kind of provider. So the provider was unable to do this. And what they decided was best, you just say, something happened. I'm sure you figured out. Or they were going to use RTFM, but that didn't work either. So you've got a number of things that generate these error occurred messages, and it's very tough to figure these out. Now remember, again, these messages are not designed for end users. They are designed for developers. So they are not to be passed to the end user who has no clue how to deal with a TDS packet corruption error. You'll also discover that they are using the same number, this -2 gigabyte number. That same number can be loaded by and caused by several different things. For example, if you try to update a row, and you get a field validation error, or a rule validation error, or a referential integrity constraint error, they all have the same number, but they have different strings. So maybe your error handler would have a test to see if it's this string or that string. Yeah, but since they've tuned up these and made some of these strings are now written in English, as opposed to developerese, which is a very, it's like Ebonics or something. It's a special dialect that's used only by developers. That can be problematic. So testing strings can be a problem. Is there a solution here? Well, it gets more interesting as ADO has been translated, localized into several languages. So the English version of this code doesn't work with the Spanish version, because if you're testing strings, yo no creo es el optimistic. Never mind. My Spanish is not good. I got my Spanish from the same place that George Bush did. Another ADO 2.5 improvement is that the ADO 2.5 now lets you persist not just flat record sets, but hierarchical record sets as well. This means that you can build, if you know how to build the shapes in ADO, you can now persist a much more complex structure in XML and then pass that to another layer. We also found that the JET OLEDD provider has been vastly improved. Now, remember that the OLEDD, the JET version 4 that shipped with with Access 2000. Getting this straight? So we have Access 2000 uses JET version 4, uses DAO 3.6. Are we confused yet? We now have a JET 4.0 provider that can be used, OLEDD provider, that can expose for the first time the table object. Now remember in the DAO days, we could say, here's my table, here's my index, party down. And it was extremely fast because you just walk the index, switch to another index, walk the index, and find the rows very, very quickly by row ID. This new provider exposes this functionality for the first time. I'll show you some code here in a minute. Neat feature in 2.5. The next section talks about implementing some of this stuff, where we'll be passing data from one tier to another. And at this point, we want to talk about whether it makes sense to pass back a record set object. Now, for the last 6 or 8 months, I've been struggling with why should I go to the trouble of passing back a record set object. Now, I'm of the old school. And there's basically two families of everything's breaking into two groups. The old school that believes in passing back the information but not the description of this information. For example, in DB Live, when I did a query, I said, select column, column, column from table, and it sent me back the data. It did not send me back the fact that the first column is an integer, or it was a float, or any of the properties of description. It just sent me back the data, and it worked very quickly. However, in the other family, the metadata crowd says, okay, when I give you the data, not only am I going to give you the data, but I'm going to give you a full, robust description of this data. I'm going to tell you the author of the book that described ADO, and everything else beyond that in the records, or at least seems that way. So you get back a whole series of properties associated with the field object. Another whole series of properties that are even dynamic, based on the provider, passed back from the record set object. So you have the properties collection, you have all this overhead associated with this particular records. You ask for a single row, you get all this metadata describing the history of this particular row every time, every single time you query. XML, on the other hand, gives you the ability to say, okay, send just the data and not the metadata. So there's an advantage here. Record set doesn't really give you that option. I think it would be cool that you could say, open record set for schema, with schema, option, property, set a property someplace. Give me the schema this time. Because I want to be able to morph my app based on the current schema, whatever it is. I have some binding I have to set up. And then after that, subsequent queries say, select record set with no schema. So it just sends you the rows, just the raw data rows, no overhead at all. Anybody would like that? Okay, you raising high enough the camera to see you? So I think we'd have the best of both worlds, and all we'd have to do is throw a switch. It would work, by default, it would work with schema. You get everything, like you do today, but throw me a switch. Because I like binary formats. The record sets are pretty much understood worldwide, but the XML is understood and is a great way to talk to space aliens. If we were going to send something, would we want to talk to space aliens with musical tones, or would we send them an XML structure? I don't know. So, but it turns out that we work with an awful lot of space aliens, whether we know it or not. Those applications that you never heard of that are going to your website, they go out there, browse to your website, and they pick up all the G.I. Joe. I'm looking for G.I. Joes. And so the mother's out there pulling through all the G.I. Joes and says, I want this. And if she could drag that G.I. Joe and drop it on her selection application that you didn't write, that she just got someplace. And now it would come back with a structure that described the G.I. Joe in infinite detail and where it came from, the website, and all this. Would that be interesting? That's cool technology. That's very cool. And that's what we're going to be seeing in more e-commerce sites, the ability to pass information between an application that you wrote and an application that's basically a space alien. So maybe space aliens can log on to the net and order G.I. Joes or try to find cameras. So these various techniques we have here all have their trade-offs. Some are very light as far as DDL. Some are heavier as far as DDL. Some take less network traffic than others. Some, once they arrive, they're a PIA to use. That's another technical term. I'll explain afterwards. But for example, if you wanted to bind to something, can you bind directly to an XML structure today? Not well. You can make something. You can draw a grid or something on the screen. You can have regions and so forth and do the whole thing if you're working with web pages. But from a 32-bit app, Win32 app, not really. So a record set gives you a lot of power there. Can you filter an XML structure, raw XML structure? No, you have to convert it back to a record set. Then you can filter and so forth. So you're often having to convert back to a record set anyway. Why didn't you leave it in the record set in the first place? So we have a lot of issues here having to do with what you get once it arrives. And what, for example, which one of these gives you the ability to say how many rows came back? How many rows come back from a record set? How do you know? Dot record count is not -1. Yes. So record count may be useful for a record set object. A stream, well, a stream has a structure built in, so you'd have to break up the structure and reinstantiate it as a record set. XML, it's there someplace. I'm convinced of it. Variant array, yep, U-bound, L-bound. Delimited string, no, not really. There's nothing really that tells you how many rows you've got unless you send it yourself, which is another option. You can send whatever properties. You can tack on the headings into a delimited string. You can tack on the row count into a delimited string if you know what it is. User-defined data structures, sure, again, but you're going to have to do it yourself. And the property bag object, again, you're going to have to do it yourself. So you're on your own for some of these objects and not for others. So as we pass record sets from tier to tier, let's say we had an application. I wrote this application is in my new book. It's just kind of a fun thing. So you push the button here, this doesn't work, and you end up with a query that makes a DLL method call to another tier. Now this other tier can in fact be in your own process if you choose, but it can be in the middle tier if you like. And what I'm passing back from this middle tier component, can I see it here? You know, the code is almost right. Is a stream object which I convert back into a record set and simply display the contents right in this in the Win32 app. This might have just as easily been a web page or something else. So passing record sets back it makes a lot of sense in a lot of cases. But again, let's not use the same. Okay, whenever I do a woodworking project in my backyard, if I can't do it with Makita, I can't do it. Okay, if I can't use the Makita and the screws, I'm out of it. So if you're a one record set guy, then maybe this is the approach for you. But let's use the right tool for the right operation here. The record set is extremely powerful. It has a bouncing error. Thank you. It can in fact be passed as a record set to the middle tier. And then once it's in a record set, it can be persisted to XML on a file basis. It can be persisted to an ADTG. It can be persisted to a stream in either one of those formats. It can also be persisted to a variant array. Now, how do we persist a record set to a variant array? In other words, we want to convert it right to a variant array. Get rows, right. So we use get rows to basically suck the data out and upload it into this variant array. And this is very fast once it arrives to the client. Passing the record set across the web, however, in a variant array is another matter we'll talk about later. We can also create delimited strings. Now, these are what I call pseudo-delimited strings because anybody who's been writing BASIC, and I wrote BASIC and was actually teaching BASIC in the 70s in college where Hewlett-Packard mini computers. When you had a delimited string, the string portion of the delimited string was put in these things called quotes. You've heard of those? Well, ADO's idea of a delimited string is they don't put quotes around the strings for some strange reason. These kids were running it. But so these pseudo-delimited strings are certainly a lightweight way to pass data, but consider that these are also in Unicode, so there's 16 bits per character. Some overhead there too. Something else that Francesco Bellegna talked to me about after one of my sessions is the property bag object. We'll talk about that too, is another way to pass things around. But you don't have to necessarily start from the record set. We can start from one of these other formats and in fact persist to a record set or translate to a record set or pass one of these other objects around. Passing a command object from place to place does not make a lot of sense, but it can be done. It's not something I would recommend. Or building a command object and then building output parameters In other words, a middle tier component is generating a command with its output parameters and simply sending the command parameters back. That makes a lot of sense. And no, you don't have to build a record set to do that. So you captured 40 output parameters. What do you do with them? How do you get them back to somebody? Create a record set and send them? No, well, I guess you could if you're into that. Perhaps create your own delimited string. Perhaps save them in a user-defined type, a property bag. There's lots of ways of sending those back from the middle tier. Or you could simply send them back through the COM interfaces. So getting this data out of the record set is fairly straightforward. We start with get rows, which outputs our variant array. Now, get rows can start anywhere in the stream. In other words, you can say start at the 41st row, start at the 7th row, and go to the end. Or give me the first row through the 40th row by passing in parameters, say how many you want to pass down. And it, in fact, dumps it into this variant array. Once it's in the variant array, then what? Anybody know of a control that binds to a variant array? In other words, you pass a variant array to it and just automatically populates. Anybody? Bueller? Okay. Nobody? I haven't found anybody to say, yeah, I know, I wrote them. So that's a problem. GetString, on the other hand, dumps out this pseudo-delimited string, and it turns out that this matches up to the clip property in the grid control. So you can drop this into any control that supports the clip property, which there's several. So you can display these rows. Question, once you have them displayed, if that's what you're doing, how do you update these? You picked a row, and the user has changed something in the grid, and you want to update it. Now what? Is the variant array updatable? No. Delimited string updatable? No. So we've lost the functionality of being able to update directly, but it turns out that most of the time we don't do that anyway. We're using stored procedures to do the updates, right? Yeah, okay. Or we're using other COM components, middle tier components, to do the updates. So this is not an issue. So you're simply being able to blast the rows back, display them, let the user make a change, and then you're using other interfaces to do the updates. You're not depending on record sets to do the updates. So the save method, once you've got this record set, the save method lets you persist to ADTG from 1.0 on, to XML starting in 2.0, or hierarchical XML in 2.5, or the stream in 2.5. So you have lots and lots of options here to be able to persist this record set and be able to move it from point to point. Now, the update method here also lets you move data from place to place. Now, this basically passes the rows down to the data provider. And how do you pass rows, how do you pass the new rows to an update statement? Well, there's a couple of tips here. One of the things you can do is you can open an updatable record set, change the rows one by one, or change the fields one by one that you want to change. Or have you tried using the variant array as passed to an update statement? Now, I have my demo machine here. I saw some blank stares here. We've got our kind of a stop. Thank you. Verbal command on this, very cool. Let's say we wanted to update this record set. We have a record set here. Question, is this particular record set updatable by default? You learned something last time. What's the default record set? Read only. So we're going to have to set up some sort of a key set record set. So when we create this guy, we're going to have stop that. We're going to have to say rs dot say cursor type or something like that. So make it a key set cursor, static cursor, whatever you want, some sort of an updatable cursor. And once that's done, we can do an rs.update. Where are my changes? Well, have you ever used this guy? I don't know what the columns are. But you give it, say, column 1, column 2, and maybe you just want to change 2 columns. And then you give it an array of values. You ever done that? You'll find out that this technique is faster because, especially remember in the active server page, we're trying to reduce the lines count. But you'll also find that this is faster in the middle tier components as well, because we're making far fewer COM references here. What you can also do is pick up this array and define this earlier in your app. So this is a one-time hit. You build this variant array that has the columns that you're interested in and use that. You also should use and update only those columns that you want to update. Don't update everything. That's also another mistake that causes more data I/O overhead that is not necessary, and also causes the server to thrash more than necessary. It turns out that you can use this same technique to add new rows. So we could say rs.add new. Okay, look, there's the same field list and variant array as you passed to the update. Make sense? Okay. So we can, in fact, pass this update to the data provider, or we can use an execute method. And this execute method, in fact, can do a TSQL insert. So you're just inserting rows. What if you have to insert 50 rows? Do you have to do this 50 times? In other words, did you have to loop through this whole operation, execute, 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 execute? It turns out you don't. What you can do instead is build up 50 inserts and in a single string, and use the execute method against that string, and it will, in fact, execute 50 inserts for you. And you'll discover it's dramatically faster. Something else you have to worry about here when you're doing that is the errors that come out in between that you may have to deal with. They're handled as individual operations. You can also do updates this way, but more likely what we're doing is going to be executing stored procedures to do this. So we can, in fact, execute stored procedures to do all of this back-end updating work for us. Now, the open method. The open method is a large mythological beast. Now, this open method accepts data from, in the new ADO 2.5 record set, from a variety of places. The ordinary data source, the SQL Server connection as you're typically seeing, or if you've saved the record set in a file someplace, even on a CD someplace, or passed it in a mail message. You can, in fact, open it against this binary ADTG format, or an XML when you're passing data from space aliens, or the hierarchical, or a stream, or a URL. So the open method has lots of ways to accept data that's pre-structured into this record set format. The command object also accepts data, but in this case, you can get data from your output parameters. And because you're not creating a record set, you're bypassing the bulk of ADO here. You're not having to create a record set, or an updatable, or a scrollable record set. You're just passing back raw binary chunks of data. Very, very fast. So, when you're ready to pass ADO data between tiers, and before you break into tiers, consider the expenses. How much memory is this going to take? How much cache is this going to take? And where is it being consumed? Is it being consumed in the middle tier where you have very little cache to waste? Because every client that comes in that creates one of these cursors, it starts to be cached on the middle tier. If you're caching in a traditional client-server sense, the client in that case has probably plenty of RAM to cache, you know, a couple hundred rows. Who cares? A couple thousand rows. But it's not a big impact. However, consider the network traffic, the LAN expense of moving all of those rows over. Question, when you give that lady 5,000 pictures of G.I. Joe memorabilia that she's looking for, will she, in fact, be able to use all those? The answer is only maybe. Will she stop shopping after they'll get bored after the first couple pages? So is your search too broad? So have you given the user too much data that they can't possibly use? Also consider whether you're passing ANSI text data or Unicode, or whether you're passing raw binary or a variant array structure. And if you use Netmon, you'll discover that there are big differences in the volume of information that gets moved from tier to tier. We also want to consider the session state or the server state. Now, in cases where you want to say, okay, I want to look up G.I. Joes, and I want you to remember where I am in this particular query. And some people, some websites actually do this. And those are the ones that if you come back, you sit there and stare at the G.I. Joe, and you ask your wife to come in and say, is this the one we want to buy? By the time you go back, you'll get the error message that says, you know, you waited too long and your page expired. That means that they were maintaining state for you. They were remembering that particular transaction on the server someplace. And they had a fuse on it, a little timer. And when that timer went off, they dropped your context. They had to, because they can't afford to keep context around except for the active users. And they define an active user as somebody who hits them within a minute, within 2 minutes. And as you add to this time to make the application more user-friendly, you decrease the amount of scalability because you can only support end users, and as those build up, and the amount of state material you save locally, it gets very expensive. So consider how much session state we're going to have to maintain on a per user basis. If you have slow systems, this simply makes the matter worse. You have a slow network traffic or a slow day where the network traffic is being bombarded with denial of service requests. I can just barely see you. You have a question out here, you're going to have to scream. You also need to consider the client. This is the client application's intelligence. It's not politically correct to say whether the user has any intelligence or not, which may also be something you're having to deal with. So you want to be able to process this stuff on the client. Question, can the client, has it been upgraded to the point where it can deal with a disjoint XML 2.5 record set? Or is the client still running IE5 and running ADO 2.1 or 2.0 or 1.0, 1.5? If you don't know, the ability to send back anything except raw HTML back to that client is questionable. Does the client have enough code to be able to bind to this structure, to be updated, to be able to figure out what's actually there, to be able to display? Is it capable of ADO at all? Are all browsers ADO capable? Does Netscape support ADO by default? Is that a metaphorical question? You also need to consider the developer skill. Remember what we said in the first topic, and we were validated over and over again here after the questions. We said so often the choice of technology has more to do with the capabilities of the developer, and the developer to understand the issues and to work outside their comfort level. So if the developer doesn't know how to work with it, then you're may be passing structures back they can't deal with at all. To get around these problems and to make these problems have as little impact as possible, you should always limit the size of the row set. This limits the amount of locks on the server and limits the amount of overhead at all levels, at the LAN, at the client side, and in RAM. So this record set, if you choose a record set, you get lots of services. You get services that let you manage not only a single but multiple result sets. Now these result sets can have lots and lots of different structures in them. You get cursor services. In other words, you get the ability to scroll through and bind and update. You often don't need these services, so don't ask for them unless you do in fact need them. And there's an entire development paradigm built around cursors and cursor management that you can leave behind and still create a successful application. You also decide and can manage persistence to files and streams and record sets and other providers using the record set object. And these features are all turned off if we do not have those, if you're not using record set. You also have control by support by controls. In other words, we have the record set itself is recognized directly by the MSH Flex Grid, pass it to its record set property. The data source property of the DB grid, again, directly supports the record set object. So you can pass these objects without, this is not binding. This simply means that you're assigning this value and having that object filled with the structure. Yes. You also have your full DDL here. So you have an in-depth description of what you have received. So you have not only have you been delivered pizza, but you've been delivered all of the the list of ingredients and how much carbohydrate and how much fat and calories and so forth, and you also have the birth date of the guy who delivered it. You want to give him a tip or a special present. We also have the ability to pass disjoint record sets. Now this gives you much of the power of a record set passed as such. And in many cases, that's the technique we use. And in order to set this up, you simply say, use the client-side cursor location. You can open your record sets as usual, and then assign the active connection to nothing. Once you've done this, ADO says, oh, he's going to disjoint. He wants me to break this guy off. So if it has not completed row set population, it will in fact do so as you make this assignment. So once the active connection option here, when you set this property to nothing, when you fall through that operation, you have a record set that's fully populated. All the rows have arrived. At this point, this record set can be updatable. But by default, remember, it's not. So you're going to have to tell ADO that you want to build an updatable record set here. It's certainly possible to pass a read-only guide. Now, the record count is going to be interesting for you if it's available. Now, remember, the default record set is forward-only. Forward-only record sets don't support the row count, so you'll see -1. But if you choose static or key set, you will, in fact, see a record count that you can use. You also get the row-by-row status. You also get the field status. So when when changes are applied to the record set, those appear in those status properties. So there's an awful lot of overhead here that's useful if you're planning on updating through the record set. Now let's look at an application here. Why aren't I using ADOR? That's an excellent question. In the early days of ADO, there was such a thing called ADOR. Now ADOR was a subset of the ADO full set, okay? And it only exposed the record set object. And what you got away with in those days was the ability to pass back this baby version of ADO to the client or wherever you're going. Well, in the 2.0 time frame, they had a number of issues that came up, having to keep those two guys in sync, the two teams in sync. They since combined them, and now when you say ADOR, while you only can see the record set object, the entire ADO library comes in. So ADOR today is simply a typewriter that says you're wearing blinders for everything except the record set object. There's no real benefit to using ADOR at all.
Why do you have to assign the active connection to nothing versus setting it?
Would somebody who attended the first session tell him about that? Because it's faster, and it is not necessary to say set. There's about 12 lines of assembly language code that do not get executed when you use this technique. It's one of the performance techniques. But thank you for catching it. Watch the video. So in this case, we are setting up our record set object. Notice we do not say dim as new, but we're going to pass this back as a structure. We set a new record set object, and we set the cursor location to client. We open up our query, and of course, I would prefer to execute a stored procedure here, but we're doing this for illustrative purposes. Something else that's going to really hurt your performance. It's right here. Anybody have an idea what it is? I'm using it about 6 times. Really kills performance. Absolutely, concatenation. In VB concatenation, there's a technical term there. It's called sucks. The guy who developed concatenation, I'm not sure whether he got some bad beer that day or what, but it is, the way they do concatenation is really problematic. And if you want to help performance, especially in active server pages, get away from that. Now, authors, such as myself, we have problems with this because while I would prefer, now technically what you should do is not use line continuation character in the middle of the string. That's the starting point. What I would do to keep the performance up was just continue the string on off to the end of the page. Now I could do that here, but you guys couldn't tell me what the rest of this worked. So as a writer, and you see the examples printed up this way, don't do it. Remember, the human interface is not nearly as important as the computer interface, right? Except in training. So you may see books and things done like that. We have to. We don't have any choice, because unless we have little things that stick out the edge of the page, kind of like fold-outs, and then we have staples in the middle of the queries. I'm not sure how we do that. So this is not a good idea. So whenever you can, avoid use of the concatenation operator. It turns out that if you want to build up a string like this, you can create a fixed length string, not on the active server page, but in a 32-bit application, you can create a fixed length string, dim string as dim SQL as string star 255. Create a big fixed length string, and then use mid to fill in the pieces. And just keep yourself a little pointer and fill in the pieces with the mid operator. 12 mids is faster than this. Because every time, especially if you're working with bigger strings, and some of us are working with very, very big strings, this operation, if you saw what was going on underneath the covers, it would make your stomach hurt. It always makes my stomach hurt. Okay, once we've built our little query string incorrectly here, we assign our connection object. We say this is the connection we're going to use. We also set the options. This is something else we also leave out of the code. We often see examples where we do not see the options command text here. Now, if you leave this off, ADO defaults to the ADBHOM, or AD unknown, which means, like, I don't know what that is, man. I'll figure it out for you. And sometimes that means a round trip to the server. Sometimes it means he has to go through a whole bunch of logic. You know, that looks like a select statement. It could be, but it's not. Maybe it's a stored procedure. And if it goes through a whole series of steps to try to figure it out. But by saying AD command text, it bypasses that entire logic stream. You say, this is command text, by golly, that's what it is. Again, helping performance a little bit at a time. We set our active connection to nothing. I'm trying to drag this down. And this, incidentally, ladies and gentlemen, is the best way to run a demo, because you don't have to worry about this crashing in the middle or having you. Okay, so when we set the active connection to nothing, we're ready to go to the client side. Now, on the client side, we have a very simple interface here. We simply say, go get the records based on the filter. This is the parameter I'm passing to my little getRecs server. And we build our local version of the record set based on that output parameter. Or not output parameter, but the return COM interface we set back. So in this case, we just see if we're end of file. If we're at end of file, we didn't get any rows back. And then if we didn't get any rows back, we can set the record set to nothing, clear out the record set. Otherwise, we set it to the record set, we display the rows. It's fairly straightforward. Make sense? Okay. So when it's time to pass variant arrays, you have to ask yourself a number of questions. This is a very specialized interface. Warning, this is not particularly efficient. Now, when we start looking at netmon, this will also make your tummy hurt. So using getRows, remember, but if you're inside a component, in other words, you're using getRows in process, that's one issue. Sending the variant array between layers is another entirely different issue. So getRows offloads the data, as we said before. It uses Unicode for one thing. It also has a high row overhead. It sends part of the DLL. Remember, a variant uses 14, 18 bytes per element to deal with whatever happens to be there. And the initial hit on each of those elements is pretty expensive, as VB and the COM interfaces figure out what you've sent. You don't get any field names. You don't get row status. So there's no mechanism there to update it. Yes, you can change the variant array if you'd like, but there's no way to know which ones are changed, which ones are not, when it comes time to update it. You also discovered that the packets sent back and forth, in fact, are stuffed with filler characters, as we discussed before. We can tell how many rows we've sent back by using ubound. That will, in fact, tell us the size of our array, the size and the width. Server-side code is very simple here, very much like we had before. Our same query, passing in the same ISBN in this case, and we're sticking that in here, select from where author like author. That's okay, it's got a bug. This should be the author's name. In this case, we're same thing, command text, but we just do a getRows and pass that back. It's very, very simple. Client-side code, every bit as simple. In this case, I'm using my own fill grid to take this parameter that came back, basically the variant array, and passing it into a grid to display it. And this is about 8 or 9 lines of code to fill the grid from a variant array. Another option is to use a delimited string, or what I'm calling the pseudo-delimited string. In this case, we're passing back simply ASCII characters. Now, these are actual dumps of a delimited string, and I've substituted a couple of special characters here for the tab delimiter. These are tabs. In other words, by default, it uses tab delimiters. And if you got confused, you notice that there's an embedded comma here. Notice that if we had embedded tabs in here, we would be SOL, but that's pretty unusual, so that's not a terrible thing. But if you did have text with embedded tabs, you'd have to come up with a different protocol. What if it had, and you use quoted? Well, it's not going to give you the ability to delimit these with quotes. That's just not an option. You also have carriage return line feeds at the end of the rows. Questioned, what are the names of these columns? We don't really know. What is the data type of these columns? Well, we really don't know. But does this look familiar to you? Does this look like another format you've worked with before? Have you ever worked with Excel in the CSV format? Well, that's what this is, without the headers. Now, what you can do in CSV is tack on the headers as the first row, and that, in fact, can solve some of those problems. So this can drop right into an Excel spreadsheet, for example, and they can import this directly. Again, this uses Unicode, so we have 16 bits per character. Very low row overhead, no DDL at all, but again, twice as much data for the same amount of information. And if Unicode is important to you, well, this is certainly an approach you can use. It also assumes you know what's coming. You know the order in which those columns are coming. You know what's going to be in the first column is in fact the book name, the year published, and the ISBN. You know that those columns are in fact what they are based on a spec. You know what a spec is? Well, some of you may not be familiar with that. I know there's a number of people at Microsoft that are not familiar with those. But it requires that you conform to the spec, and you use a spec check-in, check-out kind of paradigm where perhaps the data structures are kept in a different, commonly referred to, commonly managed file that is included in your application at the compile time. So we know what's coming, and again, this structure can be applied to the clip property and those controls that use it. However, the record count, we don't know how many records are going to come back here. Question, as we're building this string, do we know how many rows are going to come back here? Well, usually we don't. We don't know until we've gotten all the rows. Once we've fetched all the rows, then we know. So we could, in fact, build ourselves a last row, if you will, and that's what we used to do in the olden days. In the 80-column card days, we would have a trailer card. And we have a trailer card if the first column is a -1 or something like that, or some sort of an FF or something. We would say, oh, that's the trailer record, and it has the row count, it has and other DDL information in that structure too. Again, it requires discipline. User-defined structures are also interesting. In this case, we're declaring a structure of a single type where you use the type declaration in VB. You can also create an array of these types, and again, you're on your own for managing the structure and walking through the structure once it arrives. Again, it's very tight, very low overhead, and strings are Unicode, but the rest of it is still highly responsive binary data.
That's not going to have the padding problem that variant arrays has.
This is not going to have the padding problem that a variant array has. That's absolutely correct. The record count, again, you're on your own. There's nothing that says that you can't build this into the structure somehow. Again, it assumes you know what's going to arrive. Now, that may not be a bad assumption at all. If you're writing both ends of the client and the server, you're writing the middle tier and wherever it's coming from, or where it's going to, that's not going to be an issue. However, talking to space aliens, they're just going to see a bunch of binary bits. And until they find out its map coordinates to Iron Mountain someplace. Now, passing property bag objects is not unlike this structure, and passing user-defined types in many ways. In this case, we pass a single type or an array of types. And again, no ADO, but there is COM support here. In other words, with the user-defined type, you don't really get full COM resolution into the field object and so forth. Little DLL, and again, record count, very similar to what we just saw, and the technology is a little different. Let's take a look at that. In this case, we're setting up a property bag called rep title that we've already described, and we simply use the write property method and a string, and we pass in the value. And we do this over and over again. Notice that I've concatenated a null here, an empty string, to deal with the fact that these objects do not tolerate being set to null. So if you have a situation where you're passing back nulls, you're going to have to deal with that yourself. And again, we're using string binding, and you know the benefits of string binding. Not. On the client side, we basically use the read property method of this property bag object. Again, string binding. And we are, in fact, building up a string we're going to pass into a clip property. In other words, we're concatenating on tabs here, building a carriage delimited string, or a tab delimited string. So, we talked about performance in the previous talk, and we've got a couple of slides on performance here. But we'll find that we have to have cooperation on all levels in order to get an efficient application working. These optimal performance techniques require smarter designs and implementations. They also require smarter developers. In other words, the developers actually have to know what they're doing in order to get these things to work. But their managers also have to agree. And that means the client, the customer, has to agree to these approaches as well. And people that came up to me afterwards, time and again, as I've heard in other conferences, the people out in the field are often having to deal with situations where the client has already dictated the architecture, and you're having to work around that. Now, this performance is brought to bear by a number of world-class tools and engines, and the SQL Server 7 is simply one of the finest of those engines out there. It has had many, many years of support, many, many years of very focused development on these performance issues. Something else that's different that occurred to me based on a question we've asked earlier. And somebody asked, where does MSDE fit? MSDE's most important aspect is that it is not different than SQL Server. So when you write for MSDE, the Windows 95, 98 version, you write the same code, you use the same paradigm. Now, you don't get the OLAP and some of these new features, the big server features. But your client applications, your data access applications are written in the same way. I do not like to talk about the competition, and I won't talk about Oracle. But there are other paradigms where, and as a matter of fact, this is unique in the industry. This is the only database company. Microsoft is the only company that provides you a paradigm that's the same on both platforms. No, we don't have a Unix version. But we do have a Windows 98 version that has 97.6% market penetration. And the Windows NT, which is the most powerful and most popular server out there, and cheapest, certainly. So you can write the same application and have it work both places. An important point we missed the first time. I think we're almost done. Are we done? We have that. Oh, yes, we have the power-up slide. I've left some time for questions because, as I said, I'm here as a resource for you. And if you're going to leave, please do so quietly because I am deaf as a post after Vietnam. And I'll take as many questions as I can. I'd like to open up discussion. Yes, sir.